series of 5 webinars on risk management for the OCASI organizations. We're very thankful for the funding from Ontario Trillium Foundation and the Citizenship and Immigration Canada, and for all of you who have decided to take time out of your day to come and join us. So we're really, really glad. This webinar is Safe Steps number 2, Risk Proofing Your Paid Staff and Volunteers After the Screening Period. So our webinar this morning will go from 10:30 to 11:30 Eastern Standard Time. That's my presentation. My name is David Hartley, and I am the Director of Insurance and Liability Resource Center for Nonprofits at Imagine Canada, and now a consultant working entirely with nonprofits and charities. I've had the privilege of meeting and speaking with about 9,000 nonprofit leaders in the last 4.5 years in 72, 73 cities across Canada, and my focus is on risk management, governance, and leadership. So this series is entirely on risk management. I'll be speaking until approximately 11:30. At that time, Petra, who's here with me in our space capsule, will be feeding me the questions that you give during the presentation. So what I'm hoping you'll do is during the presentation, we can't hear you. We'll never be able to hear you because of the number of people on the phone. It just makes sense to do it this way. The only way we'll know the questions or comments that you might have is if you type them in the chat box. Petra will receive them. I won't see them during the presentation, but at different periods I'll stop and ask Petra if any questions have come in. So actually I may not even wait just to the end. We might actually do questions as we go along if questions are coming in. And then we'll be finished at 12 noon exactly, or a few minutes before. We will definitely not take you later. I realize that many of you got a lot of work to do today, and it's probably piling up, so I'm glad that you've spent the time to come and be with us today. Well, I want to start off by showing you something. We're talking about risk management, so I want to show you some amazing pictures. These are pictures of the Empire State Building being built in 1930, and give you a little feel for how far along risk management's come. It's amazing when you take a look at these pictures, the kind of things that people did back then. Here's a gentleman in the building who's standing on a bulb. You can see how far up in the air. Very little health and safety back then, and I can't imagine how many people died in the building of this building. You know, standing on the edge of the building with impact wrenches. You know, right on the edge. Incredible lack of safety and lack of risk management back then. And by the way, not unlike many nonprofits when they start and they have no policies, no job descriptions, no screening, working with vulnerable people. But you can see the kinds of things. Many of you might have seen this picture at the top right, where people are having their lunch and they're sitting on this huge bar overlooking New York City as the Empire State Building is being built, or sleeping on the bottom left. Can you imagine sleeping on that bar? But this is how far health and safety has come from the 1930s till now. You could see people building there just barely hanging on, and you know, with wrenches in their hands. You can't imagine people living like that. This one is the gentleman standing on a board. The other guy is standing on the board to keep it so he doesn't fall down. It's just absolutely remarkable, the kinds of things that people did back then in terms of risk management. So that's a little bit to give you a feel for how far our society has come along from then. So again, my name is David Hartley, and we're so glad you're on the line, and we hope that this today will meet some of our goals. We have 3 goals with this series. Number 1, help you find practical ways to find and manage your key risks. Number 2, to help you engage your people so policies and tools will actually work. It's one thing to have great policies, but if you don't properly communicate or work with your own people to build the policies, they won't work. So to me, it's really 50-50. We're also going to try and make this as engaging and fun as we can. So yeah, it's risk management, but we're definitely going to have some fun today and talk about some things and be very practical. So in our 5 webinars, and by the way, they're all recorded, so you can go back and take a look in the, and I'll show you later how you can do that. Number 1 we did on February 29th was an introduction to risk management. I hope that you all get a chance to see that and spread it among your staff and watch that, certainly your senior staff. Last week we did Safe Steps Part 1, and that was screening volunteers and paid staff. And today we're in Safe Steps Part 2, risk-proofing volunteers and paid staff after they join. Is everything okay, Petra? Okay. So Safe Steps Part 2, risk-proofing volunteers and paid staff after they join. And we'll be talking today about staff and volunteer orientation, training, boundaries, supervision, performance management. Next week, next Wednesday, Eric Plato will be coming in. He's tremendous abilities at training financial management, and he'll be talking about how do you know what a good budget looks like, how do you develop a good budget. So it's kind of the critical piece for financial risk management. And then finally, the week after, I'll be doing a session on governance risk management. It's a great session. I hope you don't miss it, on creating an engaged, effective nonprofit board. So today, we're on the third of the 5 webinars. Want to make you aware of the fact that we've got the forum, which is another name you could call it org-wise, the actual website where you can go and find all of the webinars after they're done. Also a lot of documents. Today I've put documents up on social media screening, which is a really interesting thing that people are doing now. I think about 75% of nonprofit leaders are saying that when they're going to hire somebody, they do Google their name, they go check out Facebook, they do have a look to see what's out there. And so I've got a great document on how you can do that and some of the concerns around that. I've got more information on police checks because I had some questions during the week about that, and you can find the information there. And several other documents which will be very useful. We haven't emailed them out to you. We really want you to go to the website and find them. By 5 o'clock today, they'll all be up there, as well as the past documents from our prior 2 webinars. So a quick review of some principles. If you're looking at what are the general areas we look at for risk, here they are. We talked about them in the first webinar, all the way from financial to mistreatment of a vulnerable client, and certainly new immigrants, many of them do fit the category of a vulnerable client. Certainly children do. Accidents, transportation-related accidents, food poisoning, internet issues, technology-related issues, workplace violence and harassment, which is covered by Bill 168. We'll talk about that a little more today. Natural disasters, severe weather, not something we face too much of here in Ontario. Key staff loss, fraud, embezzlement, theft, and pandemics. I'm not going to go over this again, but I've mentioned in the first 2 webinars about the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, and they're really critical to understand. So again, I hope that you can go back and have a look at them. I'd like to remind everyone that no matter what you're doing in terms of policy making, make sure you always use your own volunteers and staff who do the jobs to actually come up with policy writing. And when you're in a situation where you really, really need some wisdom, instead of immediately thinking about bringing someone in who's going to cost you a lot of money, consider talking to your own people, to a larger group as possible. The critical thing for a healthy organization, and I will mention this through all 5 webinars, is to remember that we need to create a place, a workplace, where it's safe to ask questions and give ideas. And as leaders on the phone today, and I know many of you are on your end and it's a busy time, you may be listening to this later in the year, the way you can tell if you have a healthy organization is, are people coming to you? Are they asking questions? Are they giving ideas? Are they suggesting that there's problems in certain policies, programs that can be fixed, bringing you ideas? That's a healthy organization, where I'm not just concerned about my little square and my little job as a volunteer, my little job as a staff member, and only working in that, and that's all I'll do. I'll only come in today and I'll only think about what I've been asked to do, no more. We want to create a place where people are thinking beyond that and thinking about the big picture and really have a true open door policy as a leader. So the key through all of this risk management is we want to know what risks we're facing. We want to take them intentionally. We don't want to put our head in the sand and kind of pretend that the risks aren't there because we're busy, that we don't maybe have a lot of funds. We think, wow, big organizations with millions of dollars in budget, let them think about risk management. We're a small organization. Let me remind you that in Ontario, 45,000 incorporated nonprofits, 55% of the nonprofits, and I think I said 45% last time, but it's 55% of Ontario's incorporated nonprofits have a budget of under $100,000. So you can imagine the vast majority of nonprofits are small in terms of budget, and so we need to do risk management regardless of that. And there's easy things you can do to step up and start. And we're going to talk about some of those things today. If you didn't watch the first webinar, we talked about how to create a risk map every 3 years, and I really recommend you go back and do that. Okay, so for today, and I've tried to do this for every webinar, would you please consider taking out a piece of paper? If you've printed the PDF, and Petra sent this presentation to you probably about an hour ago, and you can go ahead and print it. And for this page, can you think about documenting or writing down anything that we do in the presentation today that you think would be valuable for you? In other words, things that are aha moments or moments of items that you can actually put into practice in your organization. So not just great ideas, but they're great ideas that you actually can use. And I'm going to end off the webinar today, as we did last time, and ask you, how many did you write down? How many ideas did you write down from this presentation? It may be things I said, or it may be things you thought of as we were talking about the topic. But I'm very interested in knowing, does this presentation make practical help for you? Can you actually put into place ideas that happen here? I don't want it just to be another training that, well, it was a good training, but nothing practical for you to use. It'll only be valuable if there's things that you can use. So please have a piece of paper to the side of your computer, and would you consider writing down ideas as we go along. I'm going to ask you at the end of the webinar how many ideas you wrote down. So going back and just quickly, what kinds of things could go wrong with your staff and volunteers? This is a pretty good list of things that can go wrong. And oftentimes people are wondering, why should I do risk management? Well, in terms of staff and volunteer risk management, what we're talking about, last week was screening, this week with management of staff. Here's the kind of things that can go wrong. And we list 10 tips for managing these staff that I mentioned last week that are really critical in terms of managing this risk that we face. We also went through and looked at what are the 10 steps of screening. And last week we covered all of them up through number 7. Today what I want to do is focus on the second part of that, and numbers 8, 9, and 10, and talk about managing volunteers and the process around that. I also have some legal things here in terms of contracts, writing contracts for your employees in Ontario and things you need to know, and how would you let go of a volunteer. What about terminating a staff member? What's some important things to know? Because those are critical risks, not just hiring, but firing, and we'll look at those today too. Last week I showed you a screenshot that you didn't have in your presentation, but now you do. And this is those same 10 steps, but put in a little different figure. And let me just go through them quickly. From the top, we write the position description. So for any volunteer or paid staff job, it's critical to write a job description or position description. Then we start the recruiting. And we go through that process. Then we go through the selection process with interviews, reference checks. And by the way, I know I had somebody email me this week and mentioned when it comes to new immigrants, sometimes it's very hard to do. You can't do reference checks because maybe somebody who's volunteering who really doesn't have anybody that you can call to do a reference check. So what can you do? And I'll mention that in a second, some ideas around that. So we go through the selection process. We get them inside, and now we're at that part of the process where we're going to talk about today. We go through orientation and training. The arrow goes up there, probationary period and supervision. I think it's a fantastic idea, especially when people are going to be working with vulnerable clients, to put them through a probationary period and watch how they do. If it's a really tricky job, don't give them that job right away. Give them a 6-month job and a job that's less risky. With supervision, we provide assessments and evaluation for staff and even volunteers, kind of performance assessment, and that's the process. So this is kind of this healthy cycle that we can go through as an organization. So last week, I want to mention that on the OrgWise site, we put up sample volunteer screening forms, smart tips for recruiting and keeping volunteers, how to manage young volunteers, how do you understand police checks, and I put up a presentation that we did in the summer on recent RCMP changes, which you can see there as well. Now I want to give you another form here, and that is, here's some more screening resources. People asked me during the week, I got some emails on this, and so here's some links from the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in terms of they're the ones responsible for the vulnerable sector check, and you can see some information there that I've provided. So for screening, let me just go back and bring it back after looking at the questions I received this week and thinking about some things I know you're thinking about. The bottom line is, before you ever consider what sort of screening you're going to do, you have to determine how risky the job is. It doesn't matter if it's volunteer or paid staff. And last week I took you through the tremendous document. You can go back and take a look at it. That's called Safe Steps. It's a 74-page document that takes you through the 10 steps. And at the very beginning, they take you through some charts to figure out how risky the job is. And last week we went through that. So please, if you haven't heard that webinar, please go back and take a look. Take a look at this quote I just added here. Do not lower your screening standards because volunteers are hard to find, or you're desperate to place someone right away, or you have clients on a waiting list. Don't skip any steps in the screening protocol because the interview went really well, or because you know the candidate, or because everybody knows the candidate, or because the candidate's the parent of one of the children in your program. No matter what the questions, where they come from, it's very important that everybody for a certain job gets the same screening. Very, very important. It's important legally in terms of the law. It's also important to your stakeholders that you're not giving special treatment, preferential treatment to certain people. Everybody goes through the same screening process for a specific job. You might have some jobs you have no screening for. It's just a very simple situation. I mentioned that last week. But some of your jobs, we're going to be working with vulnerable people one-on-one, and you're going to make sure they go through a lot of screening and include police checks and other things from the 10 steps. Make sure you're consistent. And the last paragraph there, when volunteers cannot be screened to the same standards as other volunteers, because they're young people and they haven't had a job, or they're recent immigrants, which I know that you likely have very many volunteers or staff members that people that want to be staff members that are recent immigrants. Well, it's very hard to do any reference checking, those kinds of things. So you're going to have to supplement the screening process with other information, reduce the risk in the position, place those people in less risky positions, or increase the supervision. I mean, that's the bottom line. And that's the idea. Maybe for 6 months we're going to watch them in a less risky job, or put them in the risky job, but with always having supervision. Okay, so now your new volunteer or staff person's hired, and you signed them on for a probationary period. What's next? And that's what I really want to focus on today. Well, here's some great material on orientation. Linda Graff wrote this wonderful book called Best of All, and I mentioned another of her books last time. This is another book, and you can find her information at lindagraff.ca. So she looks at 3 areas of orientation, and this is the best I've ever seen when it comes to orientation. It's not just simple to say, well, we got new staff member, new volunteer, orientation is easy. Well, actually, there's 3 different parts: social, the position, and system. Let's look at the social. Well, we're going to introduce the new staff or the volunteers to the social community you're about to join. Welcome to the team. Help them feel comfortable right from the start, which is really critical, especially for volunteers. Those first few days, really, really critical, whether they're going to decide to keep coming. Introduce them to leaders and other staff or volunteers. We're going to describe the culture and the etiquette. What clothing should you wear? What clothing is not appropriate for certain jobs? Where are the washrooms? Where do you put your stuff? Where, when, and when do I take my breaks? Where do I take my breaks? Where's lunch? How long can I take lunch? If it's a staff position or volunteer, obviously going to change. But you can see here, this is all about the social. This is about feeling comfortable. You know, it's all the where is everything. Who is everybody? So that's the social orientation. Then there's a position orientation. We need to clearly define our expectations for their job. Again, it doesn't matter if it's volunteer or staff. We need to make it very clear what their job is and also how their position fits into the bigger position. So we're going to outline results they're expected to achieve. Is there deadlines? How will they be evaluated? What should they avoid? I'm going to talk about boundaries in a second. It's a really critical piece for risk management that's missed. And who provides them support? Are they going to get an emergency contact list of who they can phone if they have an emergency or an issue? And finally, we're going to convey to them how deeply important they are to the success of the program. So often when somebody begins as a volunteer, they are left to feel like they're this minor part of this big machine. And I know even if in small organizations that can happen. So it's very important. We're going to clearly define the position and what they're expected. We're going to give them an outline of things of what's expected to achieve and deadlines, how they'll be evaluated, and we're going to make sure they know how important they are to the success of the program. Final part of the orientation is we're going to explain the structure of the program. You know, give them an org chart. You know, who's the manager? Who do they report to? Who do they report to? We're going to give them health and safety information, provide them all the policy and procedures they need to know, a volunteer handbook or a staff handbook. You're going to make sure they get it. We're going to explain all the facilities, equipment, reporting structure, record-keeping things, whatever they've got to do. So you can see there in 3 different parts. We've got social orientation, where we tell them how they fit and how things run around here, how the lunch breaks work, and who the leaders are. Get them to know their team. Maybe you'll do an icebreaker, make it fun. They really get to know people and they get to laugh together. Position, orientation, it's serious now. We're telling them very, very clearly what they're supposed to do and what their boundaries, their positions are. And then how does their job fit into the whole big picture. A couple notes here. Volunteers need to know that what job they're given is not their decision. If a manager of volunteers or whoever's running the volunteers believes that they fit better in another position, then they need to understand that's the way it works. Now, they can decide not to stay, but it's critical that volunteers understand that they don't decide what jobs they do. They certainly can volunteer, and we want to know what they'd like to do, but it's going to be a question of what their skills and abilities are. The other thing is to make sure to consider having volunteers sign a volunteer contract. Last week, I took you through what I think a good volunteer contract looks like.
think it's a good idea to have volunteers sign and say they understand that it's a serious position, that they're expected to be there, and also the kinds of things in terms of resources that they will receive from us. Second note, this week I received from the YMCA a very interesting incident report, and it's a 2-page report. And again, this is a note, this is a kind of an aside to the presentation, but we're trying to fit the key things into these 5 webinars. If you have something go wrong, the question is, what document should be filled out? Well, here's a really good document, and we're putting it up. Petra, you'll put those, I guess, other documents up by 5 o'clock today. So you can go to the website, and I'll mention later where that is, and you can see on the forum all these different documents. I think we put another 4 or 5 today, so you're going to see well over a dozen documents there so far, beyond the webinars that we've been putting up. So that's a great document. I hope you take a look at it. I think it's an excellent incident report. So going back to where we're talking about today, so after orientation's done, what's next? Well, we need to adequately train our staff and our volunteers. So wherever you see volunteers or staff here, this is complementary. It doesn't matter, staff or volunteers, everybody needs training. So the second bullet there, consider making all of the critical components of the volunteer training program mandatory. And refuse to place volunteers until they've balanced it satisfactorily, met the training. So you can take attendance and make sure that your key pieces of training, and I'll give you in a second what I think ought to be trained, make sure that people are there, and until they've met the attendance requirements, really, you shouldn't be putting them in a place where they have any authority, any responsibility until they've been able to sit through the training. The fourth bullet there, consider requiring volunteers to sign off on the training content they've received, so they can sign off saying, yes, I took it. Why is that important? Well, from a legal standpoint, if something goes wrong, you'll be able to show your stakeholders, to show the judge that, yes, they've been through the training, yes, they signed that they had understood the basic requirements of the job. In high-risk positions, consider testing volunteers to ensure they grasp information. Now, I don't think you're going to have any positions like that. However, if you do have positions where you go, there's some things that they really need to know. It's really critical. You may have had some problems in the past. Always look behind you to decide what to do in the future. If you look backwards and you can see volunteers or staff had consistently had problems in a specific area, then do training. I like role-playing. Role-playing, instead of just telling people what they should do, have a situation. Have somebody pretend to be a client, maybe a new immigrant, and they're having a difficult situation, and something you want to train your staff and volunteers how to handle that situation. So have a real scenario. Have somebody act out being the client, and have somebody act out being the staff member or volunteer, trying to help them through that. Great way to train. People will forget PowerPoints very quickly. People will forget all kinds of training in a very quick fashion, but they very rarely forget things that have been acted out and role-played. So take your most serious things that you know your volunteers and staff really need to never forget, and do it as an acted out role-play. It's a very effective way to do it. In terms of training, be certain that training is refreshed for non-regular or special event volunteers who may not have served since last year's event. Periodically review the volunteer training program, position by position. Now, for some of you, I recognize, and I've heard some comments by email, you have very low capacity right now. Some of you have more capacity where you can review the training program and improve incrementally. Others of you need to start, a volunteer training program and start slowly. So I'm going to give you some things here in terms of what I think you need to consider. The final point there, if working conditions, clients' needs, project goals, or anything big changes, or even if it's just been a long time since you last did training, consider requiring an updated training session for your staff or volunteers. Okay, so here's some training things I think you absolutely have to make sure you do for your new staff and volunteers, and I would even consider doing this on a regular basis. You need to train them about working with clients. So make sure they understand the clear limits on the kind and extent of physical intimate contact they should be having. In other words, should they be allowed to lift people? What about hugging? What about kissing? Even greeting? In some cultures, it's very normal to kiss on both cheeks, and if you don't, it's almost considered an offense that you're not caring. In the Estonian culture, where my family comes from, it's very funny. My birthday was yesterday, and so I was at the bank, and I met somebody from the Estonian culture, and it's very, very rare for someone to kiss you. But on your birthday, you will get a kiss. It's guaranteed. And so I was in the bank, and I got a kiss from this person. I thought, yep, Estonian. It's my birthday. I get a kiss. It's just the way things are done. And it would be considered an offense if they didn't kiss me,
because that's just normal. Now you look at the French culture and some different cultures around the world, intimate contact can be normal. And so the question is going to be what's on the right side for us. That's important to train. And you know, when you're dealing with people from different cultures, I know I did a training for Muslim leaders in a mosque, and afterwards I went, people came up to ask questions, and I shook the hand of a lady, and then realized afterwards that I was not supposed to do that. So as a person, in terms of training, we need to do these kinds of things. You know, what sort of touch is acceptable, what's not acceptable, not just for our organization, but for the different cultures we're working with as well. The only way your people will know this is if you train it to them. Establish clear service contracts which specify what will and will not be provided. Ensure that both the client and the relevant family members know and understand the limits of the contract. So here what I'm thinking of specifically is people need to know when they're going to be getting help from your volunteers or from your staff members, that they know what kind of help they can get. Here's why it's important. They might think, wow, I sure would like to have this person take me to the bank, open a banking account for me. I want them to take me to the local services, sign me up at the YMCA, walk me around. Well, the question is, what services do you provide? Making it very, very clear to clients so they know, here's what we provide. That's it. Very, very helpful. And, you know, it saves some embarrassment for clients sometimes when they think, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I was asking for things that were outside, but I just didn't know. What are we doing? We're creating clarity. We're creating clarity for people that are doing the volunteer and staff work. We're creating clarity for the clients who need to know what we can do. And by the way, I know from some of your websites that you make that clear, but some of you don't. And I think that's a great way to use your website as well. Make it super, super clear on your website, if you've got one, what, in fact, you provide, services you provide. Not all your clients are ever going to go on a website. Some of them may not even have internet access. That's why it's helpful to have it on a piece of paper as well. Okay. Money. We need to train our staff and volunteers what contact they're allowed to have in relation to money with the client. It may not just be that they're going to touch the money, but can they talk about money? Can they help them with financial planning? Can they go to the bank account and take money out for them because they're sick and get the PIN number? I mentioned that story last week. It's very important. Now, what I would suggest is that you have a very clear boundary around this. In my opinion, staff and volunteers should have no discussions or dealings. I like that word, that phrase, no discussion or dealings, and I suggest you write that down. Staff and volunteers should have no discussions or dealings with regards to clients' money or any other valuables. If you decide that because of the nature of what you do, they have to have some contact, part of what you do is helping them set up bank accounts and those sort of things, then make it super clear. This is a very, very dangerous area. Again, if you have heard any of the previous two webinars, you know that I don't see very often too many evil staff members or volunteers. It's usually the exact opposite. They're wonderful staff, wonderful volunteers, and they go outside the boundary of the job and they get your organization in trouble because they're doing things that they shouldn't have done. But they did it with a good heart. The problem is we have to help these wonderful-hearted people to rein in, and I'll talk about how you can do that in a moment. One of the critical ways to do that is to talk to them about money. So we've talked to them about, you know, working with clients and physical contact, intimate contact. We've talked to them now about their dealings or discussions with finances. And now we're talking about confidential information. You should have a clear confidential information policy. It defines what's recorded, what's stored, who gains access. Develop a clear client confidentiality policy, train your volunteers and staff. In other words, the things that you talk about with your client can never go beyond there. You can't go into the parking lot and start talking about a client to another staff member, a volunteer, another client. It can destroy our organization very quickly because we lose trust. Caution all volunteers that no sensitive documents should be removed from your office without authorization, right? Harassment. We're almost done here. Bill 168 came out in 2010 in Ontario, and you can go and Google Bill 168. It's a great idea. There's two policies you need to put up. If you have more than five staff or more in Ontario, you need to put these policies up in some public place. I suggest doing it in your kitchen area. And you can go Google Bill 168 Ontario, and you can see the actual policies that the Ontario government recommends. The bottom line is it's around harassment and around violence. In relation to harassment, specifically sexual harassment, train your staff and volunteers about what constitutes appropriate behavior. That means you don't send emails that that are suggestive. You don't send dirty jokes. We don't do that. Our organization, when you belong as a volunteer or staff member, you cannot do that thing. You might think, well, we're friends. We know each other really well. That's fine. However, we're not going to be doing that in our organization. As a matter of fact, I would make that something that they understand they could be terminated for. We do not do that sort of behavior. We don't flirt with staff. We don't flirt with volunteers. We don't flirt with clients. These are not romantic connections. These are people that we're working with and that we have to have a very professional relationship with. So take a look at Bill 168, the two statements, and we've got some questions. Oh, the polls. Let's do the polls, and then we'll get into the boundary form. So the first poll we're going to put up is how often. What's that? Okay. How often? Here we go. How is it launched now? Yeah. So all of you can see that. Can you just pull it over so I can do it? How often, with your work, would either volunteers or staff be alone, one-on-one, with clients? So, let's say in a vehicle or in their home, one-on-one with clients. And I'm not talking in a public place, but I'm talking in private places. So could you go ahead and answer that, everybody? So just click 1. So how often with your work would volunteers or staff be alone, one-on-one with clients? Anywhere. So this never occurs because we have a policy. This never occurs. We don't have a policy. Rarely occurs. It occurs occasionally. It occurs regularly. So I think 83% of you have said right now that it rarely occurs. Oh, the numbers are changing. So we'll give you a few more seconds. I think half of you have voted. So for the other half that haven't voted, please go ahead and click. 57% of you have voted. 64%. Take another few seconds. 86% have voted. That's great. Okay. So 42% said this rarely occurs. 17% said it occasionally occurs. It never occurs because we have a policy. 17% never occurs because we don't have a policy, but it just never occurs. And 8% said it occurs regularly. So we've got people answering in all 5 of those categories, but the biggest is 46% saying it rarely occurs. So that's interesting. Now what's interesting here is you can see that very few of you actually have a policy on this. If we were working with young kids, for instance, the best website in the world for managing risk for children, nonprofits that work with children, is a Scouting.org. Scouting, S-C-O-U-T-I-N-G. Scouting.org is in the United States, and you can see how they do it working with kids. And they've got a rule that at all times with kids there has to be 2 adults. And that's because they work with kids, and they're very concerned about sexual abuse or molestation of kids. And it's something I take seriously as well. Let's launch the next poll. The next poll is would staff or volunteers ever need to be alone with children? So I know that you work with families, with adults, but also I imagine children will be around sometimes. Would staff or volunteers ever need to be alone with children? So go ahead and answer that, please. So half of you have voted. Okay. 71% have voted. A few more of you come in here. 79% have voted. Okay. 86% have voted. So 69% of you said no, it never occurs. 23% yes, it occurs rarely, and 8% yes, it occurs regularly. So we've got a mix. If we add up the yeses, you've got 31%, and the no's at 69%. So for those of you where this does occur regularly, you need to have a policy with absolute certainty on this one. My suggestion is you should never have volunteers or staff alone with children unless they're in a public place, like if you're in a library, in an office, at your office, where in other words other people can see. There's windows on the walls, there's windows on the doors. It's very, very obvious. So those 31%, you need to have some sort of policy on this. You should just never have one-on-one contact with a child from a volunteer or staff member unless it's in a public place.
So again, what do we try to be with risk management? We're trying to be reasonable. And I think everybody would agree that it's not reasonable to have situations where staff or volunteers are alone with kids. It puts the staff volunteer in a precarious situation from a false allegation as well. Let me give you an example. My brother's an Ontario school teacher. He also trains Spanish on his own time to make a little extra money. He teaches Spanish one-on-one with kids. And I remember talking to him early on and saying, Tim, when you go to meet kids in their homes, and by the way, my brother is about the nicest human being I've ever met in my life. He's just a great guy. I said, do you ever meet and teach the kids just by themselves in the house? He says, yeah, that happens all the time. The parents just leave me there and they trust me and they come back an hour later, gives them a break. I said, Tim, just never do that. Because although I know, and anybody who knows you knows that kids are 100% safe with you, an allegation can be made that could ruin your career. It could destroy an organization. It could destroy a nonprofit. Not in terms of losing a lawsuit, but in terms of it getting into the media. So for those of you, take this very, very seriously. If you're allowing staff volunteers to be alone in a private place, one-on-one, then I could ask you to consider making a policy. By the way, just like last week, if you want to email me and we can deal with this directly, we can do that at no cost to Ocasio or to you. Okay, let's talk about a boundary form. This is an idea that I came up with about 2 years ago, and we've seen this really go across the country. So take a look at the first two principles there. Volunteers and staff members very often have big hearts. Right? I mentioned this earlier. That's usually where the problems come from, not from people that are bad people, but from people that are wonderful. And in caring for clients or participants, they often overreach their job role, land themselves and or their organizations in hot water. Or organizations find volunteers quitting because they didn't realize the extra demands that clients may make. I mentioned last week the hospice workers, and hospice workers going into someone's home to help them as they die. And very often they're the only ones that are coming to see them. It's very sad. My own dad went through the hospice, in a residential hospice. But here I'm talking about people who are dying in their own homes and volunteers or staff are coming to see them. What we found out in doing some work with them is that very often the clients who are dying were asking the volunteers or staff, here's my debit card, would you please take my debit card, here's my PIN number, and go get some money out of the bank. So I'll have some money here in case a pizza is delivered or in case I need to give money to my grandchildren or whatever. And so the volunteer staff, they've got a big heart. They're not going to steal the money, but they do it. They give back, bring back the money. Obviously, they have no desire to steal or anything. The problem is that when the family finds out, the extended family, that volunteers and staff members have access to the finances, which they want, by the way, you can imagine, it gets very, very difficult, and we've seen some very horrendous situations come out of that. So we made a boundary form for hospice volunteers, and by the way, this is specific to the job, boundary form for hospice volunteers and staff that said no discussions or dealings with finances. You can't talk about their will and whether they should leave their kids in or out the will. You can't talk about how to spend their money. You can't go and get money out of the bank for them. No discussions or dealings with finances. What a boundary form says is if you do one of the things on the boundary form, you'll be instantly fired. There won't be any sort of three-step process. It's something that you would do that would be bad enough that would cause somebody to be fired. So I put here how to actually create a boundary form. A job description tells people what they are to do. What a boundary form tells people is what they're never to do. And if you want to just add the word never, obviously people do things they're not supposed to do, and they get disciplined for that. People maybe are swearing. I would not ever create a boundary form that said, if you swear, you're instantly fired, because we'd have to give an appendix with 200 swear words and list exactly what you're not allowed to say, and it gets too complicated. What I'm talking about here are things that are very egregious that you should never do. Let's say that you're working with young people. Many of you know that in 2008, the criminal code was changed so that if you have any sexual contact at all, any sexual touch at all with somebody under 18 years old, you're going to go to prison. And if you have any connection to them in relation to helping them, like nonprofits do. For everyone else, it's under 16 years of age. But for all those who are working in nonprofits and have access to people under 18, if they were to sexually touch one of those children, somebody right up to the day that they're 18 years old, then they've committed a criminal code violation, and we're going to help them go to prison. So we tell that to staff and volunteers and explain, you might fall in love, you might become romantically attached to a client or anybody else that's under 18. Let's just be very clear. If you, and what I put in the boundary form, and for those of you who might be offended by explicit words, then close your ears for a few seconds. If you touch buttocks, breasts, genitalia, that's what the boundary form says, working with kids, you'll be instantly fired. So these are things we put on there that there's no question of whether you should be fired or not. You just are going to be fired. There's not 3 steps. You can't do it once and we're going to let it go. Now, why would we put that in the boundary form? Why would we put these kinds of things in the boundary form? Well, we do it because they're such critical in nature that it could destroy our reputation as a nonprofit. Now, what things should be on a boundary form? What red light things? You can read more on this page later, but I've also given the full document on my full write-up on this. You'll receive it at 5 o'clock tonight on the website. You can go find it. But what things should be red light things? Things that if people did it once only, they should be fired. Well, I wouldn't put things like speeding if they drive, because if I was to be honest right now, let me ask you, those of you on the line right now, how many of you, and type it in the chat box either yes or no, how many of you have broken the speed limit in the last week? How many of you have broken the speed limit in the last week? Just put yes or no. Let's take a look here and see. So just write down no or yes in the chat box. Oh, there they go. Okay, there are a couple of yeses. There's some yeses. How many of you have broken the speed limit in the last week? Oh, they're all yeses coming in. Come on, let's see some honesty here. Let's see some honesty. Okay, we got yeses, yeses, yeses. How many of you have broken the speed limit in the last week? Okay, here's my point. You know, if you have any sort of driving that's part of your role, and you know, got people picking up fines. That's right. That's right. You know, if we put down there, if you find out you're speeding, we're going to fire you. You can imagine. You're going to have to fire everybody. So red light issues are things that, you know, there's no ambiguity. It's very, very clear. You know, it's kind of things like if you have a business and you start telling people about your business. Let's say your volunteer cuts grass for a living, and he starts telling all the clients, "Hey, I've got a grass cutting business, and I'd like you to buy something that I sell." Well, that's the kind of thing that if you knew it was happening, then I'd start creating a boundary form. This is signed every year by every person. It's job specific. You do it only for your riskiest positions. So I would not do a boundary form for every job. I would only do it at the top. You see the second line that says, over time you should create a boundary form for your riskiest positions. So I would create these for roles where you know they're risky. How do you know a job's risky? Go back to our webinar last week, and you can go through safe steps, and you can actually define how you determine whether a job's risky. But working one-on-one with kids, and some of you just mentioned that that's part of the job, I would want to create a boundary form that's very, very clear, and the kinds of things that you can do to protect the children. So that's a boundary form. Red light issues, yellow light issues, you can find some more things in there too. Okay. Have any questions come in, Petra? No. Okay. By the way, if you type in questions, we will stop on occasion and take moments to answer questions that have come in. That's great. So please feel free. Or comments, questions or comments. Last week I introduced you to the concept of the 4 Ps of risk elimination. We talked about a position, person, physical environment, and this week I want to focus in on performance management. So when you look at eliminating risk, which you can never totally eliminate risk, you have to look at position, the people that are filling positions, your actual physical environment, and then managing the performance. I talked about position last week and talked about the person in terms of screening, talked about physical environment. Well, this week I want to talk about performance management. Is it possible to supervise, support, or work more closely with the volunteer or staff person in such a way as to prevent problems from happening, right? That's what we want to do. In the blue there, we want to make certain that there's compliance with the organization's policy and procedures. And that's an integral component of volunteer supervision. So when you're looking at supervising, one of the key things you're going to do as a supervisor is we're going to make sure people are following policy. And we're going to develop and enforce volunteer discipline and dismissal policy. Staff and volunteers need to be fired. You know, oftentimes you think, well, volunteers are doing it for free. We can't fire them. Yes, you can, and you have to. If volunteers, you go through a process, you try to get them to change their behavior, and they simply will not. Let me give you an example. Somebody shows up as a volunteer, and you can smell alcohol on his or her breath. I've heard that happen so many times. Then then you realize, wow, this person's coming to work, alcohol in their breath. Maybe
in a position where they should not even be driving. Now we're going to put them in a position of responsibility in working with new immigrants or other clients that we're working with. It just doesn't make sense. So I got to pull that person aside one-on-one, get the supervisor, manager, somebody to do that, and say, look, this is unacceptable, and I would send them home. I talk to them about why it is that they, you smell alcohol in their breath, give them an opportunity. However, I'm going to send them home, and document the file. Am I going to document the file? Absolutely. And make sure that, that document what happened. If they had a reason for why that was. I had a gentleman, if you can imagine, who I talked to and said, look, the staff are saying that they can smell alcohol in your breath every morning. And I've smelt it 2 mornings in a row. I was dealing with this as a senior person in an organization. And I said to this person, I was very nervous doing it, as you can imagine. I've only known the person for a couple of days. And I said, your staff have told me, plus I've experienced it 2 days in a row. This is what the senior person told me. They said, well, you know what? I drank wine until 1 o'clock last night. Now it's the morning I'm talking to this gentleman. And he said, I didn't brush my teeth this morning. So what you're smelling is the alcohol because I didn't brush my teeth. Well, that's a very poor excuse for a person who has many people responding to him. And anyways, my recommendation for that and for other things was to fire this gentleman, and he was fired as a senior manager. It's the kind of thing we cannot put up with. We cannot put up with people. Now, it may not be alcohol. You have to be careful. You don't want to make a judgment. You don't want to assume that because you smell alcohol that it is alcohol. You got to be careful. But assuming that the person, you ask them and they agree and so on. Anyways, I'm going to document the file, and I'm going to find a way to make sure to enforce that that never happens again. Doesn't matter if it's a volunteer, an executive director, a board member. I've got to take these things very seriously. Here's a tip there. Consult with staff and volunteers who are actually involved in the delivery of services when you are determining what policies to make. And I've been saying that from webinar number 1. Here's some more things on supervision and performance management. Remember, no matter how thoroughly you screen, inappropriate or deliberately harmful volunteers can slip through. There's very few of them, but it does happen where you have people that will deliberately cause problems. I mentioned this last week. There are toxic people. There are people that will deliberately cause problems. There are people that will deliberately undermine your leadership, and you need to deal with it. You need to get to the bottom of it, and supervisors need to do it. Now, your organization may not have, vice presidents and senior managers and all these different levels of leadership, but every organization has got leaders. They may not even have leadership titles, but everybody has leaders in every organization, even people that only have 1 or 2 staff. There's volunteers who are leaders. They're not even paid, but they're leaders because they've been there long. So what I'm suggesting here is that make sure that you're looking for strong supervision so that those people who do slip through screening, and they do, are properly watched, and you can get rid of them when they need to be that needs to happen. Now, I recognize that many of you on the line, and I had a comment this week where somebody was saying how hard it is to get good staff and good volunteers. So I recognize that. I do work up in the north too, where they can wait 4 years to fill a staff position, just because it's so hard to get qualified people. That happens, especially if you have a very low budget for a job. It can be very hard to fill a job with a qualified person for the amount of money you're able to pay them, or a volunteer position where you're not able to pay them anything. But it's critical that you have proper supervision. It's critical. You can't miss this step. So you produce a very small, user-friendly handbook for volunteers and for staff. Put in there the important rules. Don't make it thick. My whole big thing is make it concise. If you can make a volunteer handbook in 4 or 5 pages, wonderful. Designate a specific supervisor for every volunteer. Now, some places I work with, they only have 1 person for everybody. But you've got to make sure that there's enough supervisors for the volunteers. Make sure that the supervisors check in regularly with volunteers. This is not just because they're watching over them to lord over them or looking for bad things. This is just to say, are you okay? Do you have enough support? Is there anything going on that I need to know about? So it's not just spot checks for clients to see how the clients are doing, but spot checks on your staff, and especially your volunteers, not get paid anything. Oftentimes they hardly get any support at all. So just the random, every once in a while, just say, we're so glad you're with us. How's it going? Do you have enough support to do what you do? So, and implement a system of random unannounced spot checks in all positions too. I mentioned that last week as well, especially with vulnerable people in unsupervised settings. So you got a vulnerable situation, and you can let your staff and volunteers know
We will be doing random spot checks. We're so grateful for what you do. It's not a witch hunt, but we have to do that to protect our reputation, to protect you, and to protect the vulnerable people. Finally, there, include in all program and event evaluation programs an assessment of volunteer performance. Give people the chance to say, wow, that volunteer I work with, that staff person I work with is amazing. So that's another way of doing performance assessment.
Next there, ensure the volunteer discipline and staff discipline and dismissal policies are clearly written. Include clear grounds for disciplinary action. That's what I love about the boundary form for specific jobs. Everybody's they're signed each year. Nobody can say I didn't know. This is what often happens is people's job descriptions are written. They start, they work their 10 years, they've had 5 different jobs in nonprofits. They're not even sure exactly what their role is anymore. They just get pulled in different directions because they're skilled. That's what I like about a boundary form is it says, okay, with your role, we're not listing all the things you're responsible for because you're responsible for many things, but we're going to list things that you can never do, and we're going to work with people who do the job to figure those out. And it may only be 2 or 3 things, you know, that need to be on there. Okay, and it's very different for every job. That's why I've never created a standard boundary form for everybody because it doesn't exist. Every job volunteer's job role is different. And matter of fact, you might have a role, and somebody might be on the line today from Ottawa, and your organization in Ottawa, you do things exactly the same. You do the exact same program as someone else who's in, let's say, Chatham, Ontario, up in Timmins, Ontario. However, even though you have the exact same program, because the culture is a little different, the people you work with are different, the new immigrants you work with are from different cultures, the culture in the city you work is different, you might have different things that would go in a boundary form. So it's very, very site-specific as well. Okay. So here's some keys to effective supervision. Now, this is risk management. You know, risk management really, I hate the term because what we're really talking about over these webinars is healthy management. It sometimes sounds like we're only dealing with a small corner of the nonprofit world, but this is a big thing. Well, here's some keys to effective supervision that are really good. What's your job? Well, you provide support for development, establish an open door policy, one-on-one meetings, praise and encourage, set high expectations, and that's a great thing. With your staff and your volunteers, you know, set high expectations. One of the things I like is this concept. I do leadership training, and I was with an organization this week who actually goes in and checks the health and safety for new immigrant programs to check that the child programs are meeting, and it's CMS is the name of their organization. I was doing some leadership training with them this week, and what was interesting is this concept of assume that everyone's a 10. So once they make it your organization, and you put them in, they're on their probationary period. The best way to assume people when you first meet them, assume they're amazing. Assume they're a 10 out of 10. And let them prove differently, which people will. They'll prove differently sometimes very quickly. But instead of thinking someone's a 0 or a 1 or a 2 because of the way they dress or because of maybe something came out of their mouth or something, let's assume that they're fantastic. They're going to be a great volunteer. They're going to be a tremendous staff person. And for that, the people often live up to our expectations of them as well. So set high expectations. Require accountability. You cannot be a lone ranger as a volunteer staff person and just do whatever you want whenever you want. You can't just go to a staff person's home. We need to talk about that. We need to set a policy. You know, outside of the work, you know, what do you want? Are you going to be okay if they just develop relationships with people and go on their own time? That's fine, but you need to create a policy on that. So it's very, very clear. I meet somebody, a client who in Tim Hortons, and can I just sit down with them and you know, what if they want to pay for my meal? I think a good one on that is that you allow volunteers or staff to receive up to a certain dollar amount. So I'd say maybe $5, $10. Somebody wants to bake a cake for you. I'm not going to say no. It's very rude to me. Someone bakes a cake, gives it to me, and says, I can't receive the gift. They want to pay for my coffee. I got no problem with that. But they should have a limit on that, maybe at $5 or $10. Put it in policy. So require accountability. Ensure understanding and buy-in to your mission and vision, right? You want people to understand that, again, it's not them just being a lone ranger and helping people, but that we have a big picture that we're doing here. Instill independence, and that means I want you to start learning how to make decisions on your own. You got the emergency contact list when you don't know. Good leaders share. They're not worried about creating somebody who's stronger than them. By the way, that's a tough one. There's a lot of lead supervisors who will never do that. They're too worried that the person will become better than them. Create ownership, and then obviously you got to evaluate strengths and weaknesses. So the 10 things that really a supervisor ought to be doing.
Some common mistakes when you're supervising too closely, right? You're just bugging the heck out of them. They just feel like you're watching everything constantly. At the early stages, you might have to do that, but over time, giving people more space. Failing to keep an employee or a volunteer informed. You know, when something important's happened, especially for staff, that's really critical. They can really, it's a huge mistake and create a lack of trust. Failing to connect employees with the organized mission, failing to listen, ignoring the team dynamics, failing to be available. That's really the open door policy. And, you know, I suggest for your key staff, take one of them out to lunch every month. One of them out to lunch. If you can afford to put it on your own budget, great. If you can't put in your budget and you don't have the money to do that, consider taking them to McDonald's and buy them one chicken McNugget. I don't know. Buy them a glass of water and one chicken McNugget. Petra, that's what we're doing after this, okay? Me and you, we're going. Are you a chicken McNugget person, by the way? Sometimes, okay. Here is that, going back to that chart now, and then I'll get into some legal stuff. Here is what we've done over last week and this week. We've talked about creating position descriptions that really clearly show what the job's for. Having recruitment where we really try to figure out who we want. Going through a selection process with interviews, and depending on how many steps of screening will depend on how risky the job is. For some of your jobs you're going to put together, you're going to have somebody who's going to lick stamps and send out envelopes. I may not do any screening on them at all. There are some jobs that just don't, you know, someone's going to come for a special event and work with us for one day. They're not going to touch money. They're not going to be ever alone with clients. It just might not require any screening. But let me just say this. For those of you that said that you know, over 30%, where you are one-on-one, have staff or volunteers one-on-one with kids, we need to really think about what we're going to do for screening, what we're going to do with training, and how we're going to provide supervision. Are we going to put people through a probationary period? And then finally, how are we going to make sure we supervise in such a way that people have a good supervisor and proper feedback coming their way? Okay. So in last week's webinar, we discussed a volunteer contract. I want to become an employment lawyer for you for a second here and talk about some employment law in Ontario that are really critical. It's 11:28. Have we got any questions that have come in, Petra? We have a comment, so let's hear that comment. And I'll read it. Okay. Okay. So the comment that we received, and by the way, feel free, please, to type in the chat box any comments or questions. Comment: boundary form is a very useful idea. We've had people volunteer to do workshops and pressure clients to purchase products or services. Well, that's a tough one, isn't it? You know, they're working for you, or they're a volunteer, and maybe they do a workshop in the situation. At the end, they want to say, by the way, I would like you all to know I'm a financial planner, and I sell life insurance, and I've got all your phone numbers. I'll be phoning you this week. Well, that's not acceptable, you know, and so it's really, really critical, the way that you define it. I probably wouldn't do a boundary form. I wouldn't do a boundary form for a workshop provider, but what I would do is give them a piece of paper that says, for doing workshops, you know, starts off, we're very grateful you're doing our workshop. Here's some things that you need to know. You know, we provide an LCD projector. Here's some logistical things, but then also here's some things that we just tell speakers that are, you know, you're not to do, and I would make that very clear. If they ever did it, after that, you would never invite them back to speak again for your workshop. Thank you for that comment. So let's talk about employment law in Ontario, and I'll tell you, give thanks to the person who has helped me in terms of putting this together, and I'll show you their name later. The key provisions for any employment contract should include, so if you're involved in writing a contract for staff members, this is not for volunteers now, we looked at a volunteer contract last week. This is for staff. Key provisions, the position being offered and accepted, as well as a job description, what money you're going to pay them, if you're going to pay them any bonuses. We don't see bonuses very often in the nonprofit sector, although we're starting to see that happen more often now. Number 3, whether the employment is set for a length of time or if it's just indefinite. If you're assuming that everyone knows that it's a one-year contract, but you don't put it in the contract, guess what? It's not a one-year contract. Number 4, specifics regarding vacation time, sick leave, and whether they can accrue time over time. Whether it will be a probationary period after the hiring. Very, very critical to put that, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Possible changes in the job or location. If you are very concerned about intellectual property, you're going to put that in there and say, look, anything you see you cannot share.
Pregnancy and parental leaves. Number 9, employment termination provisions. So let's go a little bit more into the issues of probation period and termination provisions. They're the critical things. And when I look at contracts across the country, but also specifically Ontario, and this is Ontario we're talking about, I see very often nonprofits forgetting to do this. By the way, the biggest risk you face from a directors and officers liability perspective, in other words, as a board member, as a senior person in your organization, is wrongful dismissal. You terminate somebody and they come back and say, I should not have been terminated, or it was done in an improper way, unfair way. So this is really, really critical when we're talking about risk management. Okay. So in drafting the contract, we have to look at the Employment Standards Act, or we call the ESA, which was legislation since the year 2000. So throughout this, I'll call it the ESA. There's minimum obligations that the law says have to be in there between the employer and the employee. Okay, so here's some minimum things you've got to be aware of. You can't pay someone less than minimum wage. You have to pay overtime if you're going to require overtime. You have to, there is vacation entitlement. You have to observe statutory holidays, proper parental pregnancy leaves, and termination severance obligations. Well, let's talk about termination. This is the biggest one. This is the one, if we look at, in terms of every year, the biggest bugaboo for nonprofit leaders in terms of facing a lawsuit, this is it right here. In terms of quantity, it would be slip and fall. We have a lot of people slipping and falling down and suing. But in terms of big cases, this would be the number 1. So wrongful dismissal. So employers must provide reasonable notice or pay in lieu of notice of termination cases where termination employment is without reasonable cause. I want to talk about this for a moment, and I'm sticking really to the letter here because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an employment lawyer, but this does come from an employment lawyer, so you can be confident that this information is correct. So in terms of, and you can read all these things later, in terms of looking at the Ontario Human Rights Code and looking at the ESA, there are certain things that are absolutely critical. Recent case law in Ontario has held that a written contract signed by the employee after he commences his new job did not supersede the oral contract. So it's very important, that first paragraph, to have the employee sign the employment contract before they start the job. I see nonprofits doing that. They start and then they kind of put it together as they have time. Well, just never do that. Make sure the contract's signed before they start. Okay. Be careful with probationary clauses. For some employers, a probationary period is important, and I believe, by the way, that probationary period is a fantastic idea. It provides a trial period where you can check them out and see that they're doing a good job. So a probationary term is never implied. In other words, you can never assume, and I hear people saying this all the time, isn't it automatic that there's 3 months or some period of time? Well, no. Unless you actually put it in the contract, it doesn't exist. So let's talk about how you can make it clear. A properly worded probationary clause is really, really critical. So the law, the ESA, does not refer to it or create any probationary status for new employees. However, it does provide that no minimum pay in lieu of notice is required for employees with less than 3 months of service. So that's the one thing is it does make clear is that, you know, if it's less than 3 months, that you don't have to provide any minimum pay. After the 3-month period of service, the minimum notice requirements are there in Section 57, and you could actually look it up online to look at the detail. But I just want to note a couple very important things. The hiring of an employee on a probationary term does not absolve the employer from legal duties. So in other words, you say, okay, 1 week in, you go, oh, they just couldn't do the job, horrible situation, just say, I'm sorry, let them go. We have no legal duties because you're within the probationary. Well, that's not true. Number 1, you must assess the employee in a manner that's not arbitrary, right? You have to be consistent. You can't say for one person, oh, you know, their English is very strong, and we need your English to be very strong for this particular job. Meanwhile, someone else who's doing the exact same job, their English is no better. That, you know, that's not fair, and therefore they could sue. Number 2, the employer must impose reasonable standards of conduct. In other words, you can't say, well, you have to spend 10 hours a day working. No, that's not reasonable. You know, it has to be reasonable standards. Number 3, employee must be provided with a fair opportunity to demonstrate his or her ability to do the job. You can't let them go after 1 day. They could easily go and say, look, I was not given proper time. Now, if you give somebody a week, you know, it may be plenty of time depending on what it is that they're doing. Some things might be a couple days, and you very honestly can say this was a disaster. Number 4, must provide a fair, honest, and valid assessment of the employee's competence, suitability before ongoing employment. So it's your job to tell them if they don't meet You got to tell them that they didn't meet it and why they didn't. If they do, you can tell them that and then keep them on. So the second bullet there is absent a term in the employment contract stating otherwise, an employer cannot terminate a probationary employment without just cause. So here's my point. Make sure you put in the contract the probationary period. If you want to have a 3-month probation, fine, put it in. Make it very clear. For these 3 months, and then you can actually go ahead and put the probationary clause. The clauses of probationary, there's a few of them. Again, you can Google and find them online, some different ones. I would definitely put this through a lawyer to see whether or not the clause fits your situation. The last point, that while the test for just cause for probationary employees is lower than that of a regular employee, the employer bears the onus of proving that just cause existed for termination. Okay, so issues to consider. Terminating an employee, don't take it lightly. Never, never, never take it lightly. I'm not a person that suggests calling a lawyer very often. However, if it comes to termination of an employee, my suggestion is always think about calling an employment lawyer. Not just a regular lawyer, an employment lawyer. For some of you, the organizations that are bigger, you might consider getting someone on retainer so that it won't cost you that much when you do have these conversations. For an employer, third paragraph, for an employer to dismiss an employee without any statutory or common law notice, the law requires that the employee must have done something to break the contract, right? So if you don't want to pay them, you just want to fire them, and they don't get any more money, well, then you have to be able to say something, you've breached the contract. Okay, so what kinds of things would breach that? Well, here they are, and this is really critical. I like to think of this, don't just think in terms of law. I like to think of this list as being the list of the serious list. Okay, so these are the certain categories of conduct, looking at the last paragraph, which have been recognized by courts to constitute cause for an employee's dismissal without notice. In other words, you're going to fire them and not pay them anything else. No sort of package. And by the way, it's rare now that nonprofits do fire for cause. However, it does happen, and this is the category that the list is from. Dishonesty, fraud, theft. Those are examples. You know, just obvious. It has to be very obvious. You can't say, well, they lie every once in a while. Insolence, insubordination. Well, we do see this. This is somebody who, to their boss, they walk into their office and swear at them and say some untoward things, walk out. Well, that's not acceptable. You've just, now hopefully somebody else heard it, you know, or there's something there. You want to be very careful. I'd like to have someone else who overheard that. Breach of trust or duty of fidelity. Again, this is very clear breach of trust. Very clear conflict of interest where somebody on the side is making some money for themselves. Chronic absenteeism or lateness. It just didn't happen once or twice or 5 times. This is chronic, right? Sexual harassment, serious incompetence. I think my wife told me this morning that I had serious incompetence. So I don't know if I'm going to get dropped.
And you'll be fired.
I might be fired as the father of my home. But anyways, intoxication of the workplace. We do see this amazingly. And that's a means for grounds for dismissal without any compensation. And then fraudulent misrepresentation as qualification credentials. And by the way, yes, we have seen this in big organizations. United Way had a big one happen here in Toronto. This is not a year and a half ago. And this person became a senior person at the United Way for Toronto. And when it found out that they had misrepresented themselves, that they didn't have the degree they had, number one. Number two, in their prior job, they had created contracts, fictitious contracts, and paid them, and then that money went to themselves. And they found out through some forensic accounting, well, that person was at front of Globe and Page, and that lady, amazingly a lady, usually it's a man, committed suicide within that week. It was a very sad, sad story. But the reality is, these are things that you could take very seriously, and you can fire somebody with cause and they will not get a remuneration. In each case where dismissal with cause is being considered, so you're going to consider using one of those, they need to think whether the employee misconduct can be proven. If you can't prove it, somebody, you know, staff member walks in and swears at you, yells and screams and walks out the door. Never happened before. Nobody else heard it, just you. It's very tricky. It would be very unwise for you to consider fire with cause unless there was other things that you could point to. Whether the nature and degree of the misconduct has sufficient severity to cause an irreparable breakdown in the employment relationship. That's the key word. That's, by the way, why very, very few nonprofits choose to fire for cause. They most often just prefer to give a package and let them walk on with the amount of money, depending on how many years they've been there, depending on how old the person is, they're likely to find another job, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So if you want to make it real easy, put your termination rights right in the contract. make sure when you sign a contract with a staff member that there's termination rights in there. It's going to be very clear. I was talking to somebody this morning who's a senior executive, and they told me in their contract it says that they will be given 1 month of pay for every year of service that they stay with the organization. Now that's really hefty. I think when you look at your minimum that you have to provide, I believe, is around 1 week for every year. But that organization, he's a senior person in that organization, and in his contract it says you will be provided 1 month pay for every year you're with us when it comes time when we're letting you go. So that's really clear. It's very easy. You could put 2 weeks in there. You could put 3 weeks. You could make it clear. I suggest talking to a lawyer, but put a clear termination period. Just like you're going to put a clear period of time, probation time, put a clear termination right in there. Right? So in order to avoid wrongful dismissal litigation, you do not want to go through this. It's messy, it's horrible, and it's just something that's you want to be careful to avoid. When you then do terminate them, get them to sign a full release, full and final release, that they will not sue you, and that information's there. One last thing, that's all been about staff members. What about volunteers? Here's some tips on dismissing a volunteer. Have we got any questions or comments that come in? No, nothing's come in. So please consider, we're 18 minutes away and we're going to be finishing the webinar very soon. So please, if you have any comments or questions, this is a great time to do it. We are definitely going to be finishing before 12 o'clock. So tips on dismissing a volunteer. Inform all personnel of the probationary period. So tell everybody when they're starting. I even put that, if you are going to have a volunteer contract, put it in there. So everybody knows you're going to have a chance to do this role. It may not work out. We have probationary periods for volunteers as well. Conduct a personal interview at the end of the probationary period. Tell them how they did. You're going to keep them. You decide not to keep them in the role. You're going to give them another role. You think it might be a better fit for them. Let me just stop for a second and mention, I was working with an organization about, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago, and they had a situation where they had a person in the community who was a volunteer, who was very important in that community and their religious organization. And they felt they could never let the volunteer go. If they did, they could lose a huge stakeholder. And this situation involved somebody who was driving, as a volunteer who was driving, and who had had a drunk driving conviction or a drunk driving charge. Now someone else found out about it and hadn't gone to court yet because the charge had happened but not the conviction. The question is, what do we do with this person? They felt it was very difficult on what they would do. Let me ask you that question. I'm going to put it out to all of you on the line. What would you do in that situation? Let's imagine that you've got a volunteer, very important volunteer, or staff member, who part of their job is going to be driving clients or driving with clients. And now you find out that they've been charged with, not convicted of, but charged with drunk driving. What would you do? What would you do? Would you force them to, they could not drive until they'd gone through the courts? Would you tell them that they had to take on another role, that driving wasn't the right thing for them right now? Take on another role until this was dealt with? Would you do nothing, which is what this organization had done for well over a year by that time? What would you do? Let me just see what some of you come up with as we're looking here. Okay, so I'm asking any of you out there, what would you do with somebody you find out that a volunteer staff member had been charged with drunk driving, and part of their role required them to be driving for you? Okay, so one of you came back and said, I'd have a conversation and redirect their volunteer role. Well, that's excellent. Another one of you said that you'd assign them to a new task. That's a phenomenal idea. I think that's where you're going. You said, we're going to find another volunteer role for them. We're going to find a new task for them to meet. I like where you're going with this. Anybody else have any ideas or thoughts in terms of what you would do with this person who's very important to your community, very important to a particular community and a particular stakeholder? Great. Well, I like where you're thinking there, and I have the same kinds of thoughts. I'm not going to let them stay in the same role. I don't care how important they are to the community. There's another comment that's come in. Assigned to a task with no client contact pending the court case. Fantastic. That's exactly what I think the best way to handle this is. Now, you have to be one-on-one with them. You're going to have to be sensitive because it's not a conviction. It's a charge, right? So I think
it's important to know, to be sensitive. We don't want to get in a position where we're convicting before the conviction's happened. However, I would say to them, I'd say, look, we know this has got to go through the courts. I found out about it. Is it true? And they say, yes, it's true. It did happen. When's the court date? Well, it's 5 months from now or whatever. What do you think we should do? Because we're concerned about our reputation. I'm also concerned about your reputation as well. How do you think we should handle this? And then let the volunteer give their opinion first. It usually works out right there. They're embarrassed, and they tell you, well, you know what? I'm just going to hide for a few months here. I'm just going to, do you mind if I step aside? No, not at all. I think it's a group. We understand it totally. If you want to come back afterwards and we can discuss what happened with the conviction, or if it didn't go, there was no conviction, and how you'd like to work, we can do that at that time. But to be very sensitive, one-on-one, keep it quiet, allow the people to kind of hide behind the trees for a while we deal with it. That's great. Is there anything else that came through that? Okay. So when you're dismissing, I'm just going back here to this points here, and we're almost done. Unless you have clear and irrefutable proof that an individual intends to harm a participant, you should avoid mentioning the possibility at all. I never want to fire somebody. There's been plenty of signs that the person could harm somebody or has hurt somebody. A volunteer who calls clients up, for any kinds of reasons. It could be financial reasons, it could be because of romantic reasons, it could be all kinds of things. So now we got to let them go. I don't want to judge their motivation. That gets me in legal trouble. All I want to say is, here's what I understand happened, and that doesn't meet our code of conduct, that doesn't meet our policies, and therefore I have to let you go. I'm not judging them saying, I understand you're romantically attracted to a client, I understand, that anything like that. I'm not going to get into the motivation. I just want to talk about actions. When we do board training, one of the key things we talk about is never judge the person, just judge the issue. Talk about the issue, not the person. Fourth dot there, fifth dot, the primary emphasis with dismissing a volunteer should go on a position, not the person. So you could just say, you're not best suited for that position. By the way, they get upset. I know volunteers, staff members who just say, they don't agree. But that's why you might want to have another person with you when you're doing this. You can talk about it together, and you have someone else who was there for that discussion. So there's some things that you want to do in dismissing a volunteer. So finally, all this risk management, is it worth it? We've talked about so many things from the first webinar and doing a risk map and some critical things to do to make your organization really a healthier organization. We talked last week about screening. Now we're talking about managing and supervising and performance management and contracts and writing them properly and firing people properly. Is all of this work worth it? Well, it is. In the long run, this reasonable risk management, and by the way, that's why I was having you write down on the AHA sheet, hopefully, things that you can do in the next 30, 60 days. Not things that are a dream that you never can get to, but things you could actually put in place. Because this reasonable risk management will create a safer program. You're going to be less exposure to lawsuits, and you will create better services. Your programs will be better. People will see that there's no doubt about it that your organization, they're better run. And whatever efforts you dedicate to risk management will seem small when compared to resources that a single tragedy can demand. I've been through so many situations now where a child is being molested, or even the allegation of, or where car accidents happened, or where harassments occurred, and on, theft. So many times, reputation of a nonprofit's affected, where little things could have changed things. Having the emergency contact list, talking to the staff and finding out what risks they felt were really critical and imminent. Some basic things, proper screening processes that can be done over the years. In other words, you might find that this year you're going to start doing interviewing. You've never done interviewing before, but this year you're going to start interviewing. By all means, start somewhere with one thing. But it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it in creating a healthy organization. It's going to be worth it in terms of stopping or dealing with a tragedy when it does happen, when you're dealing with a crisis communication, when you're able to say, yes, this crisis happened. However, here's the steps that we did to try to stop it. Lightning strikes. You can be the best organization, have great risk management, and still have bad things happen. But at least you're able to come forward and tell your stakeholders, tell the law, here's what we did to try to stop this from happening. We're really sorry this happened.
However, here's what we did. And then the community around, your stakeholders, your clients, the staff, the volunteers will look at it and go, yeah, it's terrible this happened. We hired a really bad person, a toxic person, but boy, we put them through screening. We put them through the right process. So it is worth it in the end. Let me ask you this, and then we're finished for the day. About your bright ideas. By the way, do you have another comment?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So someone made a comment, it would seem like in the case where the problem behavior is not observed by anyone else, the manager could put a warning in writing as a means of beginning to document the behavior for future action against the employee. For example, the email referencing what happened, and that is considered a warning to the employee. Okay, fantastic. So even where I mentioned earlier that a staff member walks into the supervisor's office and swears at them, and nobody else heard it, you have a great point. You could document that it happened, and you could certainly send, sit down with the person and say, I'm putting this in your file. It's step one in these 3 steps that we're going to be letting someone go. So let me ask you now to tell me what sort of bright ideas meant something to you today. Was there anything in the webinar? Could you type in the chat box something that you can actually put in place as an organization? You can give me a number, like if you wrote down 7 ideas, just put down 7. If you want to actually mention one of the things that you're going to go ahead and do, that'd be great as we just end off here. It's 11:52. We've got just a few minutes left in the webinar. Can you tell us something that was valuable to you, something that you could put in place as an organization, or even a number? If you wrote down 8 different things, then you just want to write the number 8 so we can see that that it was valuable to you today, the webinar. That would be very helpful. So somebody put 5. So thank you for that. So any comments that you might have in terms of things you could put into place, number of things that you wrote down, or it could be a specific thing that you want to mention to us that you think you really could use. That'd be really, really valuable to us on this side of OCASI. If you could tell us any value. Okay. All right, we've had one person do it. For the rest of you, there's another one. Boundary form, signing in for training, performance management. You had about 4 or 5 things that were valuable to you. Thank you, Lily. Paul, you said 5 things. Thank you for that. So that's great. And we'll just wait for some more people to put it in. And while you're doing that, let me mention to you that the next webinar is next week. It's Managing Your Financial Risk. It's April 4th. It's Wednesday. It's going to be great. And even if you're not a financial person, I think you'll find it very valuable. And you can bring your questions. If you've got anybody in your organization that has questions about budgeting, don't miss this webinar because we'll have somebody here who can answer questions. I expect there to be at least half an hour of questions. So please, here's some other comments that came in. From Scholastica, you said, I will plan and implement reference checks. Wonderful. That's great. Marianne, you said, this is giving me a framework to work with, how to develop a systematic approach, especially useful as I have a new volunteer coordinator just starting. We will review all this info together, and so if you're on the same page, with the same understanding of why and how, etc. That's fantastic. Really, really great. So we want to say thank you to all of you who've come today. Please come back next week. Have your budget people, your financial people on the line, because to have access to somebody of Eric Plato's quality for 30 minutes for Q&As, you're going to find that critical. Here's another, some other information to come in. Minera just said thank you, so thank you for that. Scholastica said also probationary period for volunteers, that you find that valuable. So that's great. So bring your financial people onto the line next Wednesday. Tell them to bring their questions around budgeting. Bring their financial questions because it's going to be very, very good. Very rare that you get somebody of this kind of skill on the phone, on the email, ready to answer questions that you have. And then we'll finish off on April 11th with governance. Have your board chair, have your executive directors that can be on there. Bring your questions. It's going to be an engaging, an amazing session on creating a healthy board. Thank you very much for coming today. Take a look later on the forum. You will see the things that Petra's putting up there, all the documents. And we hope you have a tremendous week. Thank you for all the good things that you do. From OCASI, have a great day.